Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, anticipated, and ultimately prepared for. A decision that unfolded not over months of deliberation, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the trajectory of European security. Hours that rewrote the rules of Western alliance. Hours that sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. What NATO announced today crossed a line that Moscow had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Washington did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, conviction, and unprecedented speed. For over 3 years now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal declarations, just signals that Washington was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a doctrine. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators. The troop movements, the diplomatic back-channel chatter, the propaganda shifts, the sudden repositioning of naval assets. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Tuesday morning, NATO officials detected what they described as an escalatory posture shift, including movement of tactical nuclear-capable systems that had not been repositioned in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: deterrence, intimidation, or preparation for action. Western intelligence didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing strategy. And when an adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by small margins, NATO pays attention. The statement issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after emergency briefings described Russia's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, actionable in nature. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, NATO's response today was among the most decisive we've seen in decades. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of detecting Russia's posture shift, NATO announced immediate security guarantees for Ukraine. These weren't the vague assurances of previous summits. These were binding commitments, protections that NATO only extends when they are preparing to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. Tonight, defense officials confirmed that NATO launched coordinated deployments across Eastern Europe, including forward positioning in Poland that had recently been expanded for what analysts believe was exactly this contingency. NATO moved before Russia could establish new facts on the ground. They reinforced Baltic positions. They activated rapid response units. They deployed air defense systems that were likely preparing to counter any escalation. In other words, NATO targeted the strategic calculus itself, the uncertainty that would have given Moscow room to maneuver. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the security landscape if left unchecked. And NATO, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't overextend. They didn't telegraph weakness. They reinforced credibility. They demonstrated resolve. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of Western support after months of political uncertainty. Putin wanted to see whether NATO would fracture under pressure. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't fracture. They unified with a speed that was so coordinated, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, the alliance did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Putin's shift as a pressure test, a way to exploit perceived divisions. But NATO proved today that they remain both unified and capable. Their deployments were not only rapid, they were calibrated so precisely that Russian countermeasures became irrelevant before they could be implemented. That coordination matters because it shows NATO has been preparing for exactly this scenario. It shows that the alliance is not simply reacting, they are anticipating. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of NATO's response. American forces carried out repositioning across multiple bases, forcing Russia to recalculate timelines. British and French units targeted strategic corridors that had been identified in the last several months. German logistics operating in coordination reportedly activated supply chains used by NATO to sustain prolonged deployments. This wasn't just posturing. This wasn't just messaging. This was strategic integration. This was unified command. And unified command is the one thing Putin has struggled to fracture since the invasion began. For every advance Moscow has made, NATO has countered with something that complicates the entire calculus. Remember, Putin thought NATO would tire. He thought European resolve would collapse. He thought American attention would drift elsewhere. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is expanding its commitments. European nations are increasing defense spending. Washington is doubling down on Ukrainian security. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners want escalation. Pragmatists want negotiation. Military commanders want resources. Economic advisors want sanctions relief. Putin is balancing these demands while prosecuting a grinding war. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The White House statement, now circulating globally, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Ukraine's security to remain ambiguous. Officials said plainly that Russia's repositioning was inconsistent with any path toward de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not backing down. You don't usually hear that tone from the administration, unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We have waited for this moment with patience and with sacrifice." He said, "Our partners have shown that commitments are not just words." And he said, "Ukraine stands ready to defend itself, now with the full backing of the alliance." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether NATO will sustain this commitment. Ukraine wants to show that they are worthy of it. Europe wants to prevent further escalation, and America wants to prevent a broader conflict. Tonight, we've heard from officials who are now monitoring Russian response in real time. They say Moscow has not yet issued a formal counter statement. They say Kremlin-linked media has gone unusually quiet. And they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader calculation intended to find cracks that no longer exist. But NATO is not backing down. In fact, NATO is leaning forward. Their response today, swift, unified, and unambiguous, sent a message to Moscow that the era of strategic ambiguity is over. And it sent a message to the world that alliances still matter. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that NATO's response was timely. It closed windows of opportunity. It reinforced deterrence. And it demonstrated that Western unity is not a bluff. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the coming weeks. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If they escalate further, NATO has already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking, it means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before. NATO does not bluff. Ukraine does not break. And the West does not abandon its allies. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is no longer waiting for protection. NATO is no longer debating commitment. And Putin's worst nightmare has become reality. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.